Good evening, everyone. I am Kyla Hanington. I'm the outreach coordinator with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, formerly the Human Relations Commission. We are the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. Excuse me. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you here this evening in conversation with award-winning poet Kirun Kapur. Tonight's event is brought to you in partnership with our great friends, the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. And as always, we thank them for all of their collaboration with us and for the great work for the county. And tonight, I particularly want to thank Olivia, who's doing all of the hard work running tech and managing the show backstage. Our guest tonight, Kirun Kapur's newest book, Women in the Waiting Room, was a finalist for the National Poetry Series and is now out from Black Lawrence Press. It has been described as a must-read for these times and beyond. And her first collection, Visiting Indira Gandhi's Palmist, was awarded the 2013 Anti-Venom Poetry Award and was a finalist for the Massachusetts Book Prize, the Julie Suk Award, and several other prizes. Described as a stellar debut by a major new voice, it was published in 2015 by Elixir Press. Kirun grew up in Hawaii and has since lived and worked in North America and South Asia. Her first job as a writer was for India's groundbreaking feminist magazine, Manushi, and from there her travels took her through Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. Stateside, her work has appeared in Plowshares, Agni, Poetry International, Prairie Schooner, and many other journals and news outlets. She has taught creative writing at Boston University, Brandeis University, and has been granted fellowships from the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Vermont Studio Center, and MacDowell Colony. Additional honors include the Arts and Letters Rumi Prize in Poetry, a Best of the Net Award, a Nazim Hikmet Prize, and the Glenn Alushi Award. In 2015, NBC News named her to their list of Asian American poets to watch. Kirun is the editor of the Beloy Poetry Journal, one of the nation's oldest poetry publications. I realize I should have asked you how to pronounce that. Can you just say that correctly for me?
Beloit, yes.
Beloit, okay. She also oversees poetry features for Drum Literary Magazine, which publishes short fiction, poetry, essays, novel excerpts, and interviews exclusively in audio form. Kirun currently teaches in the English department at Amherst College and lives north of Boston with her family. And to learn more, please visit her at kirunkapur.com. And I think Olivia is going to put up that website for you in the various chat boxes so you can save it or do whatever you would like to do. Kirun, it is so great to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's a pure pleasure.
It really is a delight. And I feel like in full disclosure, I should just tell people watching that I have known Kirun. Has it been 30 years, bud?
It might be.
Yeah. So we went to high school together way back when in Hawaii. And actually that kind of leads me to one of the things that I think is so fascinating about you and about your work. So you grew up in Hawaii. Your dad is from India. Your mom, where's your mom? Where's she born?
My mom was born in Connecticut.
Okay, so can you tell us, maybe just tell us that. Tell us about your family.
Sure, yes. My family, like many families, comes from sort of different corners of the world. My mom's family were Irish and French immigrants. She was born in this country, but my dad's family came from India. My dad didn't come until his 40s to this country. So he, spent his entire life and childhood in India and eventually came here as an adult. So we had a mixed race, multicultural, multilingual, beautiful circus of a family, which spanned from the East Coast to Hawaii to India, all of our lives. Yeah.
Well, to me, your family background is super interesting. And so we are the Office of Human Rights. And so our focus is on ending discrimination and really building strong communities among diverse people. And from where I sit, it seems like that's been your whole life, like navigating different spaces. Can you talk a little bit about that navigation?
Sure. I think, as a kid, it feels less like navigation and more like a tightrope. Or more sort of a precarious, shifting between places. I think growing up, I felt very much like I had to choose, where my identity was, which country I wanted to live in. I spent a lot of my teenage years thinking about that, and even my 20s. I spent some time living and working in India then, and the feeling that I might have to choose, I think, felt pretty strong to me. But as I've gotten older, the sense that I can just be plural and be both, and that those things are not in any way really in opposition, I think has, come more to the fore for me as I've gotten older. Hawaii is a good place for that, really.
Hawaii really is. I mean, it is a very unique place. I feel very fortunate that I got to be there and have my mind expanded and just sort of see a different way that people can live amongst each other that I don't necessarily see all over the States. And I don't know, do you find that, because you're just outside of Boston now?
I think it is special and different, partly because it's not just people from different places living next to each other. People have been intermarrying for generations, and being mixed is as common or more common than not. And I think that is a profoundly different experience to be, Japanese and Filipino and Hawaiian and Haole, white, to be all those things at once and at home in a place, I think is really profound. Different from, although, it's lovely to have cities where there are multicultural, areas, but it's different to have Nigerians living next to Swedes. That's a different experience, I think, from a place where people have married each other and made families together for a long time.
So long. I know that we're here to talk about your new collection, but for everybody watching from home, both of these collections are so amazing. So I was hoping we could start a little bit with some from your first collection. And, the introduction of Visiting Indira Gandhi's Promise talks about myth and history. It talks about how the collection sits at that intersection. And I experienced that lace throughout the poems where, like, reading, I just felt in this magical and kind of dislocated space. And it's like, I didn't want to mistake the poems for biography. And yet I also know that at times they really are. Like, it was My Father's Hopscotch, 1942. And then you have History with a Melon Cleaver. And I just felt suspended in the magic. And so I want to talk about that floating space, but I realize not everybody has been, reading these like I have right now. So would you be willing to read like one or both of those just as by way of introduction?
Yes, absolutely. Let me see. Let me find My Father's Hopscotch. It's actually been quite a while since I've read it. Page 8 here. So my father grew up he was born in what was then British India. So the modern nation states of India and Pakistan were not in existence yet. He was born as a British citizen, and then lived through the creation of the two states of India and Pakistan in 1947. So this poem is set in 1942, sort of as tensions are building that will ultimately lead to partition, but haven't yet happened. My Father's Hopscotch, 1942. 5 rooftops, wide and flat, lie shining between my father's and his uncle's house. 5 rivers in Punjab, his path spools out, a conqueror marching through the Khyber Pass. First jump, Auntie Shara's wicked chilies smirking in the sun. Second, Ranabai's old goat who gives no milk and bites a younger brother's ass. On Nana's roof, a locked up room, a sharp-nosed girl whose only word is snakes. At his command, a village burns. Troops swim the Jhelum in the night. Midway, my father stops, salams the black-draped begums who come out to take the air. They praise him as their naughty one, feed him chunks of jaggery, never exposing their hands. Who are you today, little son? Alexander? Shah Jahan? Don't tell us you're an Englishman. The infantry is restless, rumors in the streets, some rumbling, a mutiny. The east is lost, turn back, return to Greece. Roof to roof, he leaps. He presses on across the map.
Thank you. It really has such a magical element. And as I read it and as I listen to you now, the scenes are so vivid. And I know that they predate, obviously your experience. And it has, but but I'm in there in this magical moment. Can you talk about how these poems developed?
Sure. Yeah, what you said earlier about autobiography and poetry, I think is a good place to start. Maybe, certainly many of these poems are drawn from my family's history, but I do think it's worthwhile always being cautious about equating autobiography and poetry. We often sort of see them as the same, but a poem I think is a transformational device. And so no matter how close to autobiography it lies, or to any other source material, right, whether you're drawing from historical fact or a mythological story or your own autobiography, whatever you draw from, the process of bringing it into language changes it. Mm-hmm. I sometimes think it's like, making tomato sauce, right? The tomato and the sauce are clearly related to each other, and you couldn't have one without the other. But the tomato is completely transformed, right, by the time it becomes tomato sauce. Its structure is different, its flavor is different, other things have been added to it. And I think so too, even personal material, biography, autobiography, or historical fact, right, it's transformed in the process of making it into a poem. So these poems are all, those sorts of imaginative acts. Some of them drew from, my family's history for sure. But in the process, I filled in and imagined and reinvented, and the pressure of making a poem pushes you in directions that you don't expect. Hopefully a poem is not a reflection of something you already know. It's a reflection of something you discover in the process of making it. And so that always leads you away from wherever you started, even if that's close material, personal or autobiographical material. So a poem like this started in stories my dad told us. The rooftops where he grew up were flat because it didn't snow. And so, or not very often. And so those rooftops became living spaces. People sleep up there in the summertime when it's hot. People have gardens up there, or sometimes they build little apartments or dry their chilies in the sun, or they might have a goat up there. And kids, of course, especially in the old towns where my dad grew up, the buildings are very close together. So there are these little alleyways in between. And as a kid, he would jump across them, safety notions of safety were, of course, different in that era. But that was a great pastime for children. So the poem started with that, with those stories. And then, of course, my having seen those rooftops, and I have never seen a child jump between them, but I have certainly looked across them at other houses, slept on them as a child, and so forth. So, it began in that sort of family material. And then the pressure of making a poem, and a poem that then fits in a larger collection, of course, altered that. And the characters here are invented. The objects on the roof are invented. The rhyme drives the poem in particular directions. But I think as I was working on it, what I wanted to do was begin to get the sense of the way that history is so layered in this place. And the feeling that what Alexander did when he came to that place and what the English do there, are all interwoven in the imagination of this place, in the language of this place. And out of that, I think, came the poem.
It is, it's such a great collection. And so, you mentioned the partition of India, and I did have a question about this, which was, I realized that not everybody viewing is necessarily going to know, and I'm not expecting you to, we only have an hour, but are you able to just give maybe a 3-minute, I was thinking about the poem. I want to make sure that I get the name right. The History Family. And I was wondering, we see so much about how the partition, and that seems like the way I read the collection. And again, maybe making that mistake regarding biography and history, but how much that impacted your family. So I was wondering, I guess that's 2 questions. One is, could you read the poem? And then just talk a little bit about what that sort of, it seems to me like a lingering impact in your family story.
Yes, absolutely. Sure. So as I said, British India was all one. India, Pakistan, and what's now Bangladesh, they were all part of the same country. In 1947, when the British leave India, those countries are divided. And at the time they become Pakistan, East Pakistan, which are connected, although separated land by land, and then India. And that separation prompted the largest migration of human beings in modern history. I think it's still the very largest. So just the size and the scope, I think, is hard to remember here. But anywhere between 2 million and people cross the borders, in that time between 2 and 12, and between 1 and 2 million people died in that process. It was an incredibly bloody conflict that arose as the new nation states were born. And so Hindus who were living in the part of British India that would become Pakistan, many tried to cross the border heading to India. And similarly, Muslims who found themselves suddenly in India, the new country of India, they crossed going the other way. And that crossing resulted in, I think, an incredibly deep scar on both countries that families, especially families in the North, continue to carry. And certainly in my family, it was a great sorrow and silence, something that was impossible for my dad to talk about. And so, was kind of felt as a presence, an absence that's a presence, at all the time. And slowly little bits of stories came to be. And of course, as I got older, I read and learned, about it myself. But it is, I think a deep wound in the subconscious of the subcontinent, even now. And one of the reasons I think for that is that so many people were lost. And in my dad's family, his immediate family survived, but the extended family largely did not. Another part of it was what happened to women. There was tremendous violence against women. Women raped, kidnapped, forced into marriages on both sides of the border. And this a kind of grief that people couldn't speak about and still have trouble speaking about. So it was, I think the silences and the pressures of that, were something that I grew up with and that definitely found their way into this book.
Yeah. I could go so many places. Do you want to read the history? Okay.
The history family, let me see. I have to find it now. The history family. They left by train, one bulletproof vest between them. My grandfather and his brother raged. We can't leave. How can we stay? One bulletproof vest, 8 people. There are limits to what you can share. How do you know what's worth leaving? The brothers debated and raged. In a family, you have to share everything. I can hear my father explain. Whatever may rage between brothers, a family shares what it has. I can hear my father explaining. When a cousin loved my bright red bangle, a family shares what it has. You must take it off and give it to her. When a cousin loved my favorite bangle, a mysterious fact was explained. I took it off and I gave it. It was lovelier on her wrist than on mine. This is the fact of the family. Even fate must be shared between us. My grandfather wanted to leave, but he agreed to wait and see. He wanted the family to leave. His brother thought it would all blow over. How much are you prepared to see? Whose fate are you willing to share? His brother was sure it would all blow over. Their neighbors had been neighbors for generations. They had a long shared history, a cup of sugar, an extra rupee, advice about the weather. The neighbors had always been neighbors, And now they became something else. Scrounging up the extra rupees, my grandfather bought a vest. No one can guess what will change them. One day, the blind man was found dead. My grandfather finished with waiting. He knew who would go, who would be left. The blind man lived one street over, left dead on the porch under a spotless sheet. One brother would go and one would stay. Their fates split between them so cleanly. He left them behind on the porch. His brother, his nieces, his nephews, their shared fate shattered between them. A family is just you and a mirror. My grandfather's 8 went to India. They were there when independence was proclaimed. A family is a house full of mirrors. I never asked who wore the vest. My father was there on Independence Day. Freedom flags, banners, fireworks, and a long parade. The vest was saved for another day, for the family in the mirror who would never leave by train.
So good. So good. I have to say that as I was reading these again today, like in preparation, to be fresh for tonight, I was like, Kirun's a really big star. Why is she coming to talk to me? So thank you so much. Like, these are so amazing. They were so, so good. And really both collections, like, it's such a privilege to have you here and to, thank you for visiting your previous collection, because it is just completely amazing.
Thank you. That's very sweet.
I do want to talk about this. So Women in the Waiting Room, which came out did it come out sort of like mid-pandemic?
It did, October.
Tough time. It's a tough time, but I'm so glad to see it. And I have a lot of poems from here that I want to talk to you about and that I'm going to probably ask you to read. I don't want to overwhelm you with it. I guess what I want to start with is I know, and this collection suggests at the fact that you worked for years at a women's shelter, a crisis line, and that you've lived for 40 X years as a woman. And so Woman in the Waiting Room, I mean, like, for me, as I read it, I just constantly was like, I was like, oh yes, and then, but also, oh no, at exactly the same time, because it's like the resonating, the yes is how it resonates, and the oh no is because it resonates. And I mean, it's just incredible, these poems. So a couple that came to mind that I was wondering if you'd read is, the first one is Girls, Girls, Girls. If you would read that to us. And then I have questions, so many questions. Okay.
Sure. This is a poem actually set in Hawaii. It's Hawaii obviously is very beautiful, but it's also many other things. And this poem tries to get at that a little bit. Girls, Girls, Girls. Along the strip in Waikiki, past sailor bars and clubs, the length of beach where lipstick sunsets smudged and magazines would shoot and caption paradise. Past posh hotels where M and I would wait for some nice man to buy us a drink from the bar. We'd watch the women walk like they were stars on stage, dress like they couldn't wait to be undressed, leaning over into idling cars. Out on the west side of the island, Jay tells me any man she dates is more likely to hit her than pay for her dinner. Teenagers holding babies spit at us when we stare. What you looking at? You got nothing. I have nothing, sobs Elle today on the phone. I know it isn't my fault, but when I think of how I let him do it, over and over, even helped him cover it up, I hate myself. I'm thinking of the man who owned the noodle shop, the man who'd always sit with me and chat about Hanoi, warm water in canals, moms on bikes with babies tied down front and back, how to tell a ripe papaya. I saw him on the news a few years back for smuggling women in refrigerated trucks. He owned the bar called Girls, 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 a few doors down from where he served me pho, the one whose sign was made of neon legs that kicked and kicked until they were a stain of light. We liked to swim along the South Shore when the tide was right. You had to time your dive or crack your head against the reef. More than once, a girl washed up. Sometimes they named her on the news. M and I drank kamikazes on the lanai of the new Sheraton, the chief of security coming out to check we were the right sort of girls, regaling us with stories of the wallets stolen off businessmen by ladies visiting their rooms, a theft they'd later blame on the hotel maid. I hate Elle's voice, mine. When I think of how many times have I said it? How many times have I said nothing at all? Or tried to explain why we aren't at home, the right sort of girl and the wrong, why we're all out under the orange streetlights.
So good. So good. The neighboring poem is called Hotline, and you have poems with that title that repeat throughout. And for those who are listening today and they haven't had a chance to get to this collection, can you talk a little bit about what you were trying to get at there?
With the Hotline poems?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think of this book as being about speech and silence, and about the way we all come to moments where we struggle to speak. And that can be because of violence, or illness, or grief, or fear. Sometimes even love, right, drives us to a point where we feel speechless. So I wanted these poems to enact that struggle, that feeling that silence, on the one hand, is something that we struggle to overcome sometimes, to find speech again, to find a way back to our voices when we've had a profound experience of some kind. Mm-hmm. And I also wanted them to capture the other side of silence, I think, which is that it can be protective, right? It's out of silence that creativity comes, creation comes. Silence can be nurturing and protective as well. And so the Hotline poems, I think, are the place where those two sides come together. Mm-hmm. They're formatted as a caller and a counselor. And in the beginning, the first few, the caller and the counselor are clear, who's who on the page. And then as the series kind of goes on, that falls away. And sometimes you struggle to wonder who is the caller and who is the counselor. And I think my hope there is that we become all the people in this conversation, both listening, doing the hard work of listening to someone suffering, and also able to both speak into silence and sometimes to just sit in silence when we need to. So that tension, silence and suffering and voice, those are all sort of at work in the poem. And on the page, you see it to some degree. The poems are fragmented and spread across the page with white space and silence between the words.
They're, incredibly, the whole collection is incredibly powerful. And that's like one of the things as I was planning for tonight and like thinking about what I would have you read. And I was like, I wonder if Kirun would just read the whole collection from start to finish. And I didn't think that was a reasonable ask. But there's just, it is hard to pick poems to say, can you read these? Because they're just, each one is extraordinary. And I think this collection, which, as I said, reading it and feeling like feeling seen and feeling those echoes of memory or experience and in some way, and you've hit it here, where whether it happened to me or I was a witness to somebody else's story, that it just resonates sort of every single page. But I think, you talked about survivorship and like one of the questions that I had, and through your work in the women's shelter and in this collection too, and I think you've hit on it here with Studying in Silence. So maybe we've already kind of got to the answer before I've asked the question, which is when, for those of us who somebody comes to us and shares their struggle or their trauma or this event that was so impactful to them, what are ways that we can respond, and again, for those of us who aren't trained, we're just sitting here and someone comes with their story. What are like effective ways to sit with somebody?
I think listening is really at the heart of it, and letting their language guide yours. People often know how they want to think about something even before they're sure that they know that. And that shows in their language. And so rather than impose your way of processing the event or thinking about it, you can follow their language, mirror it back to them, give them space without rushing in to fill it. Let that silence, feel welcoming and creative and protective, and work with the way that they see it. I think is the most important. Any deeply traumatic event, I think one of the most difficult features of it is that someone takes away your power. And so what we can do as listeners is give that power back to the person who's telling their story by letting them tell it their way, and letting them decide, what they want to disclose or not disclose, how they want to think about it. Right? We can return that sense of power to them as listeners, rather than having a sort of prescribed sense of what it should be.
I think that is huge. You just said that giving their power back as listeners by letting them tell the story in their own way, that is incredibly powerful. And I think hopeful, because that is not a difficult act for us to be able to do, I think, which is to sit and listen to someone. You have another poem in here, which I also want to make sure I get the title right here, and I'm going to mispronounce this. So if anybody who gave me an MFA is listening, you can take it back because I'm about to say this word wrong, which is the Steubenville ghazal.
Ghazal.
Ghazal. Okay. Gotta keep my MFA. So I would love for you to read this, but I do want to talk about the structure of the poem and what a ghazal is, and how the form, I think writing in form can maybe be freeing. And I guess that's where I'm going, but I'm hoping you can share this. Absolutely. So folks listening, this poem is like absolutely genius poem.
Yes, let me just find it here. So I should say, by way of warning, that this is a poem that was inspired by the news. And it's about a sexual assault case in Steubenville, Ohio, in which several members of the football team were found to have assaulted repeatedly an unconscious classmate, photographed it, carried her and from place to place, dumping her finally in front of her parents' house, and then shared on social media the photos and videos of that event. So that is the beginning of this poem. But I hope, as with all the poems in this book, that one of the things that it's about is the fact that this happens everywhere to everyone, and that it's not located in one culture or one place in any way. But it is something that we all share, and as such, we need to talk about and think about.
And sorry, actually, before you begin, I've just realized again that there's some language in here. And Olivia, you're backstage. We're on the library's platform. We have some language in this poem. And is it okay we can do something else if we can't go forward with this one? I didn't think ahead about that. Are you able to let us know if we can go forward? Okay, we're good to go if you're comfortable, Kirun. We're good. Thank you, library, for that.
Sure, yes. This does have some strong language in it.
Yeah.
Steubenville ghazal. It was hard not to notice the style of him. We were all mesmerized by the smile on him. Snaps, sexts, he might, I might not. Friends teased, post a pic of your thigh for him. There's a strip mall, a steel mill, the long Veterans Bridge. The white picket grin was the lie of him. A basement, the music, coats draped on the couch. I kept drinking and thinking, don't be shy with him. He posed for the camera, his hand on my neck. I lay still underneath the hard guile of him. I dream I'm a clear wind. I dream I'm blank space. I dream of the girl who's surviving him. Skank, slut, cunt, whore. What did you expect is the cry from them. Skank, slut, cunt, whore. These are the facts from the trial of him. In Delhi, a bus. In Houston, a bridge. There's New Bedford, Toronto, Dubai for him. For a girl to be innocent, she has to be dead. The newspapers await a reply from him. My name is redacted. It no longer applies. I end every line writing him, him, him.
Thank you. That poem, that is a poem that when I read it, I was like, Kirun is a genius. It's so powerful. It really is so powerful. And I think when I say thank you, I mean that for multiple levels. So one is reading for it tonight, but for writing it, like it's so real and true. And my guess is that it resonates for many, many, many women in many different circumstances. And the power of that poem is extraordinary. And it does take me, I don't want to like too lightly move into a different area, but I'm looking at that form and how every line ends with him. And I know that when we talk about writing sometimes, and people love writing in like a sonnet form. When I say people, I mean me. And because sometimes the form can open up the creativity. And I'm looking, because you have these style of poems several different times in the collection. So I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about the form and how you chose the form for these poems?
Sure. The ghazal is a form I love. It's a form I grew up with. It's a beloved form, I think, in South Asia and really all over the Middle East, right? It's beloved in Iran. Persian poetry is full of ghazals. It comes originally from Arabic poetry, right, into Persian poetry, and then eventually into Urdu, in the subcontinent. So it's a form I love. It's one I grew up with, and this is very much not a traditional ghazal, I would say, in the sense that traditionally the ghazal is composed of couplets, but they're not thematically linked. They don't tell a story, a narrative story overall. And one of the great beauties of the ghazal is the way that it creates a mood, which links it, a kind of environment, which links it. And then, of course, the form links it. At the end of every line are two elements, kafiya and radif, repetition and rhyme, that echo through the poem. And so those formal elements and the kind of mood that they create are what really bring together the traditional ghazal, even though there's great space sort of in terms of subject matter and imagination between the couplets. I here have made it an American ghazal, I would say, in the sense that it is all about one story here, more or less. But I think my attraction to it in this book has to do with the way that repetition is so deeply connected to memory. And that particularly the kinds of memories that come out of deep feeling and trauma, we return to them, right, over and over again. And that kind of sense of needing to move the mind over a particular set of words or events repeatedly, I think gave rise to my interest in seeing if that form could speak to these subjects in this book.
It is amazing. Like, it is amazing what comes out from that form. And I just think that poem that you just read, I felt like every word, and the white picket smile was a lie of him, or that was just, it's absolute genius work. It was a pleasure. So it was a pleasure to read. Obviously, the subject matter is very, very serious and resonant, unfortunately resonant, but a pleasure to read this incredible work. I have a couple more, and I think I'm going to make you bounce back. Can we bounce back? Because I had meant to ask you to read a poem. And again, going back to our work, right? Looking at these relationships between and among diverse people, and with more or less, friction, and in our work in our office, really working at like building that understanding and trying to fight discrimination when it occurs. And you have a poem in the earlier collection that I felt is so resonant, unfortunately resonant for really a lot of what we're dealing with today. And I'm just gonna make sure that I get the title right, The Nobody Nation. And I will say, so for those listening, there is a section in the poem, and Kirun, I'll just ask you, where there are some laws written down. So I don't know how you want to. Do you read this one out loud? Do you know how you tackle that part of it?
I usually do a little condensing. When
okay. All right.
Let me just find it here. Nobody Nation. It is a long poem. I'll just say by way of warning. In sections. And the title, Nobody Nation, comes from a line from the great poet Derek Walcott, where he's describing his own lineage, coming from, growing up in the Caribbean, in St. Lucia and Trinidad and Tobago, and then, but having ancestors that came from Africa and from Europe, and from many parts of the world. And he describes that, and then he says, either I'm nobody or I'm a nation. So that was the inspiration for the title here. West. So it's in sections that are all compass points. West. Out of the ribbons of heat, trumpets blaring, lights flashing rapturously, the state trooper directs us to the side of the Arizona highway, begins yelling at my father in Spanish. Red dust and sagebrush, and I know instinctively this isn't something I'm allowed to see. Try to train my eyes on saguaros. Earlier, as we wheeled down black tarmac, they'd stood like cartoon families, row after row of small gray sisters, large mothers of green, arms raised, come out with your hands up, a cactus game where little ones and big surrender over and over. I keep expecting my father will open his mouth and in spiked, precise English, quote Locke on rights accruing naturally. Instead, when I gather my courage to speak, he's inclining his earth-hewn head as the man shouts, comprendo, and I realize this is another language he has always known. East. In Nizamuddin Marketplace, my mother ponders piles of pale towels, a housewarming gift, as the man behind the counter flashes pawn-pinked teeth and assures her, finest quality, madam, 300 rupees. With a careful look at me, he says in Hindi, tell your mem saab it's a good price, and we'll split the overcharge, you and me, 50-50, like brother and sister. My mother smiles beatifically, her eyes tree green, by which I know she means for me to play along, keeping her Hindi secret. We're perfect in our parts. Me, the secret, she, the mem saab to the hilt, ordering fleets of wiry attendants up ladders and down to the bottoms of storage bins, sailing out with packages wrapped in string. In the street, I see her face is set like a plain white plate. But she motions to a shop where I always beg for rosewater ice cream. I hand her the brother money, and under a sign where a rosy milkmaid dances for her blue-skinned lover, we spend our gains on sweets. South. I show my father a page from my 8th grade history textbook. Although the South was well known for its anti-miscegenation policies, most states had similar laws. And then a chart. State, Arizona. Law first passed, 1865. Law repealed, 1962. Races banned from marrying whites, Blacks, Asians, Filipinos, Indians. Note, Filipinos or Malays, Indians or Hindus added to the list of races, 1931. California, law first passed 1850, law repealed 1948, races banned from marrying whites, Blacks, Asians, Filipinos. Colorado, 1864, law repealed 1957, races banned from marrying whites, Blacks, Native Americans, Asians. Idaho, first law passed 1864, law repealed 1959, races banned from marrying whites, Asians. North Dakota, law first passed 1909, law repealed 1955, races banned from marrying whites, Blacks. Wyoming, 1913, first law repealed 1965, races banned from marrying whites, Blacks, Asians, Filipinos. And on down the page, I show it to my father. He considers the page, hums a little, tunelessly, then lashes his newspapers back into place, creaseless, tall and straight. On the black and white columns, figures seem to twist and fly. At first, I think it's Urdu script, but when I refocus my eyes, I see I'm facing the messages of the New York Times. North. It's the wife who shows me how to top and tail French green beans, placing the knife at a 45-degree angle, so the slender bodies taper, artfully, she says. Her husband watches election season commentary on the kitchen TV. They are throwing a dinner party. I am earning my books and cigarettes, and everything feels bright under recessed halogens. During the commercial break, the husband casually, "So tell me, are you a citizen?" The beans are stacked neatly on the chilled glass tray, and I wonder if he means, "Can you vote? Or will I have to pay you under the table?" The guests drift in. I blanch and plate and scrub their tile clean. It isn't until I'm enjoying the Volvo's heated seats, watching the snowbanks streaked with road debris, that he puts his hand on my knee. The moon dips low. I'm only a few minutes from home, and I know. Pacific. When my father becomes a citizen, they retake his fingerprints repeatedly. Outside, there are coconut trees, and the sun is headed for the sea. "I'm sorry, sir," the officer says good-naturedly. "You're a man of mystery. All the identifying whorls have worn away." They're forced to press his palms to their forms. As we leave, traveling a long hall lined with portraits of past presidents, my father whispers to me, "I kept the good lines for myself."
Thank you. Thank you. I love that. It's just, each part, and there's so much of it that, each little part has so much that resonates. I just want to say for people watching, if you would like to type questions in, we would love to ask them of Kirun. You can type them into wherever you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. And I see that we actually already have our question from Library Super #1 fan, Miss Vivian. And she's wondering about, there you go, what does the title mean, Women in the Waiting Room?
There's a sequence of poems in the center of the book, which is a sort of portrait of a friendship. It's a story about two friends, one of whom is going through treatment for cancer. And that series is about their friendship and the way that speaking and listening can save us, even when medicine can't. So the title came from that series of poems. But I think more broadly, I think it's about a space that that many women find themselves in, listening and speaking, and finding their way.
That's great. As we wait for more, I know that Olivia will put up more questions. Well, I have a question just about India, which is, and I'm going to ask you to make a generalization at any time that you don't want to answer any question I ask you. Feel free to say no. This might be the one. What do you find in general that people who are not from India think that they know about India and get wrong? Like, basically, how can we do a better job? Do you have is there something that comes up for you all frequently?
Wow, that is a tough question to answer. I don't know. I think that there are many, many things. I think partly people don't maybe realize how diverse India is. Right. India is a place with hundreds of languages, many different regions, and it's impossible to generalize about it. And I think, of course, what happens here is that Indianness kind of gets compressed, and you eat certain food in a restaurant, and you feel like that's Indian food, but that's really only a very tiny sliver of it. So just bringing, I think, to India and to any other that you perceive, the sense of great range, right? People have a full range of humanity and variety everywhere. And just as, when you see a movie about Americans and you are an American, you don't assume that that one character in the movie represents all Americans. You know that that's one particular person in a great story, a great tapestry full of incredible diversity. And the same thing is true in India. We see a very limited amount of film and TV from there. So not kind of assuming that teaches you something about India as a whole necessarily, but knowing that's one tiny sliver. You're putting your eye up to the people and just seeing one little glimpse of a country that's vast and ancient and incredibly modern, and cutting edge, and all the great range of things that humans and countries are.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Thank you. I was thinking about I've done exactly that same thing, which is saying that I love Indian food to someone from India whose eyes rolled so far back in the head that they could see their frontal lobe. And I was like, I'm sorry. So we have a question from the Office of Human Rights superfan, my dad, Mark Hanington in Hawaii. Hi, Dad.
Hi, Dad. That's the best.
Right. So he's wondering, when you were living in India, did you feel at home or did you feel like a visitor?
It's a good question. Both, I think, is the answer. I do feel at home there, and I do miss it terribly. There's some way, some of that is just, if you live in a place where you don't look like other people, which is what happens here, when you go to a place where you look like everyone and no one even registers your appearance in any way, it's kind of a profound feeling. And that is one of the great, great pleasures for me when I go to India, is that I look exactly like a Punjabi girl. Nobody thinks twice about it, and nobody, until I open my mouth, nobody knows anything about me in the way that here, immediately people say, "Where are you from?" And they need to localize me because I, look different, I think, largely, or my name indicates I might be different. So that's certainly part of it. But mostly it's I think, just the smell of home and the feeling that I'm going to be with my family and, eat the fruits and foods of my childhood is one of the things that makes me feel greatly at home. And then in other ways, of course, I do feel like a visitor there. I don't live there anymore. And I've never lived there as a complete, as somebody who grew up there entirely. I've always been an outsider to some degree. So both feelings, I think, are there just as they are for me here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you have, so you have these 2 award-winning collections, right? Like correct me if I'm wrong, didn't you kind of like have this first collection drop and then like you were everywhere and won everything? Maybe not. Those are my words, not yours. But
that's true.
Yeah. Well, you've had two wonderful collections. Let me just say that. And they are wonderful on their own, and then they have also been recognized in their wonderfulness. Do you have something else you're working on right now? What's going on behind the scenes?
Oh, I am, I see. I'm working on, I'm always working on poems, although this year I have to say has been a little crazed. And I have not, I ended up sort of backtracking, I think, with the work I had been doing on a next book. In this summer was, as it was for many people, summer in which I lost a lot of people. My father-in-law died, two of my aunts died, then my dad died. So it was this kind of like cascade of loss. And I think it changed for me what I want to work on. So I'm sort of struggling to find my way forward with what I'll work on next. At the moment, I'm writing poems related to gardens a lot, and to, there's a particular form of a garden called a paradise garden. And so I'm sort of thinking that over as a place in which I might meet some of the people I miss.
That is beautiful. What is a paradise garden?
It's a kind of garden that comes out of the Islamic tradition, and you see it in the Middle East, in Iran, and in South Asia. It has a water course often down the middle of it, and a particular, in South Asia we call it charbagh, four squares, usually in the garden, with a central water source, and it is reflective of paradise in some way.
Okay, I love this, and I love this idea as a collection, or like a way to think about a collection of who you might meet. That's going to be amazing. I'm really looking forward to it. No pressure, but when you're ready, I'm looking forward to it.
It will happen.
Yeah,
you never know what will happen with a book, I think.
Well, I was reading, I know we're almost out of time, but I will say I was reading your interview with Jackie from a couple of years ago, where you had been talking about a different collection about I'm going to get it wrong. Abelgard and Eloise. And I should know who those people are. Yes. Are you still working on that?
No, those were poems I kind of wrote after the first collection when I wasn't sure where I was going. They were love poems. I think I really just wanted to do something that felt really different than what I had been doing before. I wanted to get away from sort of family and history, and I worked on those poems for quite a while, but they live somewhere in my hard drive. I don't know that they'll ever, rise into being full poems. And that might happen with my garden. I don't know.
Well, I'm excited. I am excited to see what comes next. So please let us know when something else comes out. I will say we are out of time, and I don't like this time because there is never enough time. I always need like several more hours with whoever our very special guest is. So I do want to take the time to thank Prince George's County Memorial Library System again for the great partnership.
Yes.
And to Olivia for all their work backstage, making it awesome. Kirun, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here this evening. I love your work. I love you. And it was just a thrill to have you and discuss
it's just a complete pleasure.
Your collections are just amazing. And so for those of you watching, thank you for being here, and please check out Kirun's work from your local library. You can get a virtual library card from our friends, PGC MLS, but you can also go to your local library if it's not them, or you can buy either one of these from your favorite independent bookstore. I just can't recommend both of the collections enough. I do also want to let you folks know about a couple of other events that we have coming up, again, with our friends, Prince George's County Memorial Library System. We're super excited that next week on May 17th, for the anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, we are talking to Steve Suits about his book, Overturning Brown. And on May 25th, we are completely thrilled. We're welcoming Simranjeet Singh, who will be talking to Jordan Denari Duffner about her new book, Islamophobia. And that should just be absolutely amazing. So please set a reminder to join us for that. There's lots of more great stuff coming up with the library. So you can check out their events page at pgcmls.info/events, and at our events page, which you can get at by going to tinyurl.com/PGC HRC events. And so thank you, everybody. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Olivia, again.
Thanks so much for having me.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.